going on, everyone? Welcome back to the recaps for the Charlotte Open. I am recording this on Wednesday morning, the 29th, but I'm recapping what happened yesterday, the 28th. It was a crazy long day. Played against two kids. The first game was not so interesting, so I'm going to skip ahead quite a bit to the end game that we got around here. So I just had traded a pair of rooks, and I thought that maybe I have some small chances to press in this position because I can get the move a4 in and try to sort of infiltrate in the queen side. But then my opponent played b4, and it became clear to me that that wasn't going to happen. Because if I push my pawn to a3, he can get his rook over, and then his bishop, and I'm just losing the pawn. Am I losing the game then? Probably not. It's still close to a draw, but if I'm not going to accomplish anything with the pawn push, then there's no use for it. So I just decided to stay solid. And here I was debating offering a trade of rooks to go into a king and pawn endgame, or a bishop ending, king and pawn ending if we trade the bishops. And maybe I should have just played rook f8 here, and we would get something like this, just a draw. But I played king h7 first, which made it a little bit unpleasant on myself because he was able to get his rook in first. I, of course, kicked him back and then threatened to infiltrate this way. But eventually we just traded rooks, and that might have been a bit of a mistake because what I was afraid was going to happen is that my pawn on a4 would end up being loose, and he will somehow bring his king over and take it. And I underestimated that he could kind of shut down the king side, so I have no way in. Like, I played g5 here, inviting him to take, which would actually allow me to win the pawn back. And then he actually has to be careful not to lose because he might end up being pushed back. But he just held his ground, and I realized that I have no way to infiltrate the king side because the king can never go to f5 because of this pawn. It can never go to g5 because of this pawn. So, and at this point, I was actually pretty low on the clock. I had exhausted a lot of time throughout the game trying to figure out how I could push for a win, but nothing really came of it. And at this point, I had like 10 minutes left, and my opponent probably had like 30 or 40 minutes still. And so he started pressing me on the clock. He was trying to bring his king in. It became clear that I couldn't save the pawn. And so I was a little bit worried, like, I'm down a pawn now. Will I be able to hold this endgame? But, I was just playing quickly. There's not much of a breakthrough for him, luckily for me. And so we kind of maneuvered around, and eventually he offered a trade of bishops after going back and forth. I accepted because I realized that there's no way through for him. I just have to sit tight, and even though this pawn can become a pass pawn, it doesn't accomplish anything, because if he pushes it to a6, well, then I will just sit with king a7, and he has no pawn breakthroughs. Everything is shut. And so we shuffled back and forth with the kings. I just had to be careful not to take the pawn here, because that would be losing. He would take, and then he would push b6, and then he would put his king here, and now his king will end up invading, and I will start to lose my pawns. But I knew not to do that, so in this position, I simply went back with the king, and a draw was agreed. And I was able to, solidly draw a game where maybe I was a little bit in danger at the end. But my third round game was a lot more eventful. So in this game, going in, I was the top rated person on 1.5, so I got paired against the lowest rated on 2 points. A 10-year-old kid whose rating was about 1850, but he had beaten two 2000s going into the game. So I knew he was going to be dangerous. And so I decided to play the English, but funny enough, we transposed into like a Caro-Kann, Panov, knight of 6, knight c3, and here he decided to go for the fianchetto variation with g6. And so I played queen b3, and now this is all pretty much theory. Black allows their pawn on d5 to fall, and I develop my bishop in a way that I can try to hold on to the pawn, because he's going to try to attack it one more time to try to win it, but I'm going to defend it one more time. So he plays knight b6. He's attacking the pawn 3 times, but I'm still defending 3 times, so I'm still safe. Knight d2 I played, and here the most common move is bishop g4, trying to trade off the defender of the pawn. But he played e6, and he played it rather quickly. And so I was confused, because I've looked at this line before, and I've never seen this e6 move. And so I was thinking, like, did he just come up with this idea to sack a pawn over the board, or is this some kind of elaborate prep? So I spent like almost 10 minutes here trying to be safe, make sure that I'm not walking into some kind of a trap. But I eventually decided just to take. I mean, there's nothing really better. He takes back to the bishop, and now I have to move my queen somewhere. I dropped it back to d1 just to be safe. And now I'm just up a pawn, but it is this isolated pawn on d4, which is hard to kind of work around because he's going to put a lot of pressure on it. At least that's what I was thinking. And so he plays knight b5 here, or knight b to d5, I castle. He plays queen d7, and from this point on, I proceeded to get a very good position because I simply played knight f4, hitting his bishop. He traded knights, but when he took this way, he helped my pawn structure in that now I no longer have an isolated pawn. I have two connected pawns, which means that the d4 pawn will now always be defended. I just have to watch for the c pawn. He plays rook c8. I gladly take his bishop. Now I have an extra pawn and the bishop pair. Things are looking good. I defend the pawn on c3. He drops back to his queen to defend his pawn on b7. I bring in the queen. I develop the rook. Natural moves. He comes back with a knight. Strange looking move, but his knight actually had nowhere to go. So he wanted to reroute it to d6. And so I started to push the a pawn. Because if I can trade off my sort of weak pawn on a4 and break up his queenside pawns, maybe I can pick up even another pawn. He plays queen f5, and I played bishop e4. The one thing I will say is that I was spending a little bit too much time. Like by this point, we're 21 moves in. I had already spent almost 40 minutes, and he only spent about 20. But my position is looking increasingly better and better. I play a5 here. He decides to play knight d6, setting a small trap. I can't really win the pawn, because if I take, he has this move, knight takes bishop. And if I take his queen, the knight will recapture. So I would be losing a piece there. I had to be careful not to blunder that. But I just drop back with the bishop, making sure his knight can't get into the juicy c4 square. And so he took. I took with the rook. He attacked my queen. And this is a kind of a critical early moment in the game. What do you do? Well, what I could have done, just played it simple, was drop the queen back to a2. Pawn on a7 is close to falling. Maybe he can try to hold on to it with knight c8, but black's position is just super passive. He's down a pawn. I have two connected pass pawns, which is long-term should be a deciding factor. But I saw an opportunity to do something kind of fancy. So I thought, okay, I have this big advantage, but it's going to take a very long time to convert because there's still a lot of pieces on the board. So what if I simplify things down? And I realized something. His queen is close to being trapped. It has almost no squares. If I play the move bishop g5, it'll have nowhere to go. But my queen is under attack right now. So I played the move, queen takes rook. Sacrificing my queen for a rook, he obviously has to take back, but now I play bishop g5. This is my genius idea. I give up a queen for a rook, but now I'm going to win his queen back. Basically, he could have played here, and then I would take the queen, and then take the pawn. And I would be up 2 pawns in this endgame. My back rank is covered, no threats. He found a little bit better version of losing his queen by playing knight c4, so that when I take, he at least takes this rook, eliminating the threat to his pawn. Now we trade bishops. And so I was happy still going into this endgame because a lot of pieces got traded, meaning the task is a little bit simpler now. I have 2 connected pass pawns, and his a pawn is not really going to be that much of a threat. So I played rook a1 to hit his knight. He dropped back, and around this moment, I needed to really slow down and kind of come up with like a plan. And really all I needed to do was activate my king and just start to mobilize the pass pawns. But I played rook a6, thinking that, okay, if he moves the knight back, I can take the pawn on a7. And if he blocks, well, then I will gladly trade and then mobilize my king. And this endgame shouldn't be too difficult to win. I have, once again, connected pass pawns. The bishop is better than the knight. Should be a smooth victory, more or less. But he played knight d8. And again, what I should have done is just drop back the rook, make sure he has no way to attack my pawns, and then just start to bring the king in. would be a little bit annoying because he could kind of plant his rook here, but eventually I would kick him out and start to move the pawns up the board. But I calculated for a few minutes and thought that I could just win this pawn. I foresaw this move. And here I have to be a little bit careful, because if I play rook c8, he has this little trick where he takes the pawn, and if I take, he takes here. And I'm not even going to be able to save the d pawn because there is a back rank threat. So that's why I played rook c4. He played knight f4, another move that I was expecting. I dropped back, and here I thought that he was going to play rook b1, threatening knight e2. But then I thought I would just play g3, and he can go there. I'm just going to move my king forward, and he has no threats. But, of course, in this whole sequence, I overlooked the move knight d5. And this is a problem, because now I have no way to save the c-pawn. So I go from having two connected pass pawns to having just one very loose pass pawn, which is going to struggle to get up the board because even his king is not too far from being in front of it. And now I was starting to be frustrated because I knew I had his big advantage, and suddenly it's very close to being a draw. And at this point, let's see how much time I had. I had already less than an hour. Yeah, I had about 50 minutes at this point. He had an hour and a half. He was playing very quickly, I mean, as kids usually do. And so I started to mobilize a little bit, started to try to figure out how I would move the pawn up the board. Brought my king in a little bit, but he got his rook behind the pawn, and then he came up with this very nice move, knight c5. I can't take the knight because then he'll take my rook. And so then he plays knight e6, d5. At this point, I was so frustrated because I realized that I'm on the verge of losing my d-pawn after knight f4 and bishop c4 and rook d4. Because now the problem is, to hold the pawn, I need to have my bishop and rook defending it. If I go to a2, bang. He takes the bishop, I can take his knight, but then he takes this pawn. Draw, or even black might be slightly better here. If I go to b3, he can just attack my bishop and just harass it, and once again, it can't go to a2, so he'll just go back and forth, it'll be a draw. So here I played g3, basically offering up my bishop, and once again, going into this endgame because I thought, okay, if I have the pass pawn, maybe it'll have some chances for him to go wrong if he doesn't have like good endgame skills, because objectively this is just so dead. Like, black might be the one with better hopes here. But to my surprise, he played knight e6. Very strange. He was kind of scared to go into the rook endgame. He thought, I'm just going to keep the knight. And so now we're back in business. I defend my bishop. He drops back with the knight. And here I play rook c7, and his knight is actually now kind of trapped. He goes back with the king because if he had made a different move, like for example h5, rook d7, I'm just winning the knight now. So he goes king f8, I go king e3. And now again, I spent a long time here trying to figure out how I was going to make progress. I'm like very close to trapping his knight, but I can never quite do it because he'll just defend with the king, and I can't push the d-pawn because the rook guards. So I played f4. He plays f6 to try to get his knight to f7. And I decided to actually take the pawn. And I knew that he was going to play knight f7 and kind of box my rook in. And here, I debated dropping the rook back, but it's kind of trapped if it stays on the h-file, so I decided to give back a pawn and then extricate my rook. And then he comes back with his rook and offers a trade. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take that because I feel like being up a pawn with his pawns fixed on light squares, I still have some chances to try to win this. But at this point, I had already very little time. Like, I had less than 10 minutes. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I had 7 minutes at this point after I played king d5, and he has over an hour. So at this point, it's very difficult because his knight starts to kind of check me, and I have to dodge the checks. I have to slowly try to make progress. But eventually, I got the move g4 in, which is a very important moment because obviously if he takes the pawn, I take his knight, and then I would win the pawn, and then I have this winning endgame. Because as long as I don't trade the pawn. As long as I go here, this is winning. So he did not take, he dropped back with the knight, allowing me to check him and get the pawn to g5, which is progress, because now I'm actually fixing his pawns on the light squares. And now I just started to maneuver the bishop, making sure his knight can't really enter my position. And I started to push the h-pawn. And here I played bishop e2, he plays knight e4. And here I decided to push h5. Now, what I could have also done is played bishop f3 and baited him to play knight g3, which would have been a huge mistake, because then I can actually track down his knight and trap it. I didn't really realize this in the game because I had like 5 minutes, but this would have been a nice thing if it worked. Now, obviously, he could have moved his knight to a different spot, but who knows? So here I played h5, and he doesn't want to take the pawn because then actually I can't take with the king. That falls into a little bit of a trap because then he forks me, and actually black would be winning. But I would just collect the pawn, and eventually he's in Zugzwang here. He can't defend the pawn on f5 because he has to move either his king or his knight. And so we would get this position, and this should be winning with the 2 pass pawns. But he played knight g3, forcing me to play h6. He moved his king out of the way. And at this point, I have like minutes on the clock. And I'm trying to get my king in and trying to get my bishop in and win the pawns. And so we get to this point, he plays knight c4, I have 2 minutes on the clock. I'm realizing that he can kind of sit. If I play king f6, he can play knight e3 and stop me from getting the bishop in. And if I go here, then he can go here, and he's like constantly in position to give me checks to the knight. It's hard to make progress, and me being so low on the clock, I might just run out of time. We're playing with 5 seconds increment, which is not a lot. And so here, I took a tremendous leap of faith and played bishop h5. Idea being that if he takes the bishop, I'm winning because I play check, and my pawn is going to promote. He can't stop it. I give up my bishop and one of my pawns, but I'm going to make a queen. But, of course, he has this check, which I saw, and I thought that I was winning after takes and takes. But it turns out this position is a draw if black plays the best move here. It's actually a very critical moment, and he was a little bit panicked. And psychologically, I think after such a long game, he was not prepared to make the right decision here. But I'll leave it to you first. What should black play? So if you said h4, you are correct. Black should just start pushing the pawn, because I'm going to bring my king in. And here, I actually need to be careful, because the move that I thought originally to play here loses. Because after this happens, he promotes and I promote, he would have this check, forcing a trade of queens, and then he makes it to the pawn first, and this is now winning for black, because he will start to push the pawn down the board. I realized that as he was calculating, but he made a huge mistake and played king g6, thinking that he would keep my king out. But this actually loses the game, because king e6, and now I play h7. And he has to make way. He backed up, but I promoted, forcing him to take, and now I plant my king on f7. And now, even if his pawn was already on h3, it would still be winning, because I give a check, I promote with check, and that's checkmate. And that's how I won the game in 87 moves. Brutal game. So exhausting, so frustrating. That I had such a big advantage, and it came all the way down to this. But I think in the end, I put a lot more energy and effort into the game than he did. He spent like only 1 out of his 2 hours. But there's really no excuse for this taking so long to win. I mean, out of the early middle game, the advantage was pretty significant, and at various points in this game, he could have made a draw. So I consider myself pretty fortunate that I was able to get this win. And so I was finishing day 2 on 2.5 out of 3. Next round actually starts in under an hour. And so I will hopefully catch you later for the next recap.